Welcome to this edition of Simsbury School News. My name is Dominique Avery. Today we're going to talk about special education in Simsbury with my guests, who are the Simsbury School District's two top special education administrators. Sue Lemke is joining me today. She's the Assistant Superintendent for Pupil Services, who, if you're a regular watcher, you've met here several times before. I'm delighted to welcome you back, Sue. Thank you for coming. Also joining me today is Nancy Forsberg. She was appointed this summer as the Supervisor of Special Education, and unlike Sue, she's both new to me and to the Simsbury school system. So before we get down to the main subject of special education, I'm going to start the way I usually do with new appointments with Nancy. So Nancy, what I really want to get from you is, since you're I don't know if you're new to Simsbury, but since you're new to the school system, tell me a little bit about where you went to school and what got you interested in the area of special education.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me here today. So born and raised in Massachusetts, went to Fitchburg State College and dual majored in both special education and regular education. From there, I went on to do my graduate work at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., got my master's in deaf education, and then just kind of put out feelers to where life was going to lead me next, and that brought me to this great state of Washington, where I lived for 17 years there and worked as a teacher and then a school counselor, and then went back and got my administrative degree at Western Washington University. Did not apply, but was headhunted to come to the American School for the Deaf in West Hartford, where I worked as principal and outreach coordinator, and then decided that I needed to look at some new options out there. And I do, in fact, live in Simsbury. So this just felt like a really great way to give back to the community that I live in. And I had heard amazing things about the school district and their collaboration with folks. So I decided to put my name in the hat, and was fortunate enough. I say that I won the educational lottery, being able to work here in the district.
A lot of people who are hired here say that. It's really true.
It is.
So you went all across the nation, Washington to Washington.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
So what interested you in the first place in the field of special education?
I always knew that I wanted to do something with children. I mean, from the youngest age, whenever there was a baby around or a kid to watch, I was naturally inclined to do that. And then when I hit my later years in high school, I found out a place called Camp Joy that was run by the Worcester Area Association for Retarded Citizens at the time. That was what it was titled. And it was a camp run for low-income families who had kids with special needs. It cost $1 a day for the families to send their kids to camp, and I worked there at the camp. I was too young to be a regular counselor. I was only 17 at the time, so they gave me a one-to-one assignment with a multi-handicapped kid. So in hindsight, I go, that was an interesting way to think about things. So I had the pleasure of working for 6 years with a young lady who was multi-handicapped, and that's when I really found that was a connective tissue for me to work in both the area of working with deaf kids and working with kids with special needs.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with
welcome.
us. So you've been here before, and I know you've shared how you got into this job before, but maybe some people may not have seen it. Why don't you share how you got into the field? And this job, I know, is you have said is returning to your roots. So how did you get there?
It's a full 360. There's a lot of similarities actually between Nancy's story and my story as far as how we got involved in special ed. I was the determined babysitter whenever there was an issue, and I guess I was always attracted to the underdog for whatever reason that might be. Whether a student needed some extra assistance physically, if they were struggling with something. I remember at a very early age being kind of tapped in elementary school to tutor other young kids, and it just was a natural path for me. As I went on in my schooling and started off with a bachelor's in school psychology, I really wasn't sure whether I wanted to go into education, whether I wanted to go into clinical psychology or not, and had some pretty amazing experiences also at camp, working with students who were deemed at risk for a multitude of different reasons. And It's the underdog component in me. It just pulled on my heartstring, and felt like these students needed a voice that they didn't have for one reason or another, and that I could be their voice and could be their advocate. So after working at that camp and doing work regarding behavioral interventions for a number of summers, when I went back for my master's, it was a no-brainer for me to get into the field of special education. So I started off as a special education teacher, mostly at the middle school and high school, and then in the summers I would work with preschool autistic individuals, just for something very, very different. So I went with students at the high school level with mostly the exceptionality of emotional disturbance, and then I would want to do something very different at the preschool level. From there, I had a pretty incredible mentor, and she said, you really need to think about administration. And so I went all along that lines, and as a part of that program, I had a professor saying, you really should think about general education administration. At that point, I really wanted to open my own alternative high school and do something very different, and he kind of moved me on to this general ed path that eventually led me here to Simsbury. I've been here for, this is my 12th year, unbelievably. Started at the high school as an assistant principal, then the middle school as principal, then to human resources at the central office, and that's why I'm saying I'm now come back full circle working in special services. So it's been a pretty incredible journey.
So I said we were going to talk about special education, and both of you have touched a little bit on what it means, but let's pretend that nobody has any idea what we mean when we say special education. Either one of you, jump in. What is special education for the totally uninitiated?
Do you want to go?
Sure. I think for the novice person, we're looking at a student who has, in special education, a student who has a designated disability in a category. So that can be anything from a learning disability to a hearing impairment to a health issue that impairs their ability to access the curriculum. We're also looking for a student that is going to need what we call specially designed instruction. So in the special ed category, they need something different in order to be able to access the regular ed curriculum, and that's how a student sees special. So they need something beyond what we can give in what we call intervention from a regular ed teacher. But for all intents and purposes, they're kids with just different needs.
So how is it decided, or do you decide who needs special education? Is it the parents who come forward, or the teachers, or these days are those children identified many, many years earlier?
D, all of the above.
I was just going to say D, all of the above. It depends. A parent can make a referral if they have concerns, and that there's a very specific process that we have to go through. We have a federally based timeline of evaluation. So a team comes together. It's called a planning and placement team. It could assist of certainly parents, the student as appropriate, that students' teachers, guidance counselors, if that's appropriate, administrators, and we come together and say, okay, what is the concern? What data do we have to show that there is a concern? And what type of concern is it? Is it an academic concern? Is it a behavioral or a mental health concern? And then we have the opportunity to conduct a series of evaluations. So we have a lot of different tools that we can use, and really that's based upon what is the student showing us? What is the potential need that this student might have? We assess that need, and then based upon that assessment data, we make a determination whether, one, does the student meet the criteria of having a disability? There's many different disabilities that can fall under that broad umbrella and category. If so, then they are given what's called an individualized education plan, or an IEP. And in that IEP, we certainly share the data. Where is the student currently functioning in many different areas? What are the strengths of that student? What are the concerns? And therefore, what are we going to do about it? So we take those concerns and we develop goals and objectives for each individual student. And then we also discuss what are the accommodations that a student might need based upon their disability. So let's say a student has difficulty processing information, that there's slow processing when they receive information visually. Then as an appropriate accommodation, we might say, okay, when given an assessment, there's, a test, I should say, or a quiz, there might be the need to have that child have additional time based upon the slow processing speed. So that's one of a course of many different examples that I can give. But what that team would stay consistent throughout the school year, and we are required by law to meet at least once annually at another PPT and to look at that IEP and say, okay, how did the student do relative to those goals and objectives? How do we know? And what do we have to change for the coming year? One, is specialized instruction still needed? And if so, what does that need to look like?
So I, on Facebook, not so long ago, I ran across somebody that I know who has a special ed student, and she had just been to her child's IEP meeting, and she talked about how much prep work she did, looking for discrepancies and outlining her goals and gathering factual and legal data to support her assertion for more services, and that it's obviously overwhelming for her. This must be very overwhelming for parents who, I think she has always felt that she had to fight for her child. Is that and that the school was fighting against her. So.
And I certainly can comment on it. First of all, it's extremely difficult. It's a process that's filled with a lot of, we talk about educational jargon. It's probably doubled or tripled in special education. So this administration of special education administrators, we're really looking for ways that we can partner with our parent community. One, to provide some of that support and that education, but also at the end of the day, we are all working for the same purpose, and that is student success. One thing that I would like to comment on, our special education parent-teacher organization. We have certainly our typical PTOs, but we also have one specifically for special education, parents of special education students. And Diana Yeisley is the president of Supt. She's really rejuvenated that group. We have a number of parents that are really committed to this mission of working together collaboratively. So it's not an us versus them, but it's a we working for our students. And I think we're certainly getting there. It doesn't come overnight. There's a lot of trust that needs to be built, but certainly as an administrative team, we're committed to that.
So describe for me sort of let's say on the elementary school level, a teacher or a parent notices that the child is not recognizing letters or something, and perhaps there's a problem with dyslexia. So they come to school and she's hoping that he's going to learn. So how does it actually happen? Just walk me through sort of what happens at that level. Does the teacher say, go to the administrator, say, and I think this child is having a problem, or does she call up the parent, or?
Sure. Well, so we have in Simsbury, there's a tiered intervention process, right? So we're always, whether it's special ed or regular ed, we're always looking for the least restrictive environment for a student to learn it, most independently. So in that tiered intervention, we're going to put layers on. So we're going to try something and see if that's working. But it starts with a conversation between the teacher and the parent, or the parent and the teacher saying, I'm concerned. Either way, and they'll go through that process. It's we have a handbook. There's step-by-step procedures so that everybody's on the same page. They have meetings. There are intervention teams that are talking about who are we concerned about on a regular basis. So teachers can bring that to administration and then go to parents and say, how are we going to address these issues? So there's 3 levels of intervention before you even get to special ed. So hopefully we're catching these kids early. There's a lot of focus on the primary, those building blocks of kindergarten and preschool, and catching them there if we can. We also have the 3 folks that are bringing kids that are identified early. So it's either participant, either side coming to the table with a concern, and then layering those interventions and seeing what works. Because the last thing, we don't want to put a kid in special ed if they don't need that level of intense service. So if we can catch them with the interventions that are in place, we do that first. And the parents are, if you look in the handbook, they're such an important part of walking through that process, because we have them for this little bit of time, and we've only known them for that amount of time, where the parents can bring that extra information to us.
So you both talked about the length of time that you've been doing this, and the whole field of special education seems to have changed so much. Can you talk a little bit about what the changes that you've seen, good and bad, or are they mostly good, or?
I think one of the greatest changes that I've seen is this commitment to inclusion. Even though, I've been in the business 20 years, there's just a greater commitment to making sure that our students are educated in the general education classrooms to the greatest extent appropriate. And that's been phenomenal. I think another piece of that is how our community members are responding, how our teachers responding, and how our peers responding. That's what I see. It's not different. It's, hey, this is Johnny, and he's in our classroom, and this kind of peer work that's happening around inclusion is pretty incredible. I've certainly seen that. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the costs of special education are skyrocketing. They are, and it's this certainly wanting to make sure that we are providing that specialized instruction for our students, but also understanding that there's fiduciary responsibility associated with that. That's not the feel-good part of special education, but it's something that's definitely become certainly an issue.
So is that where some of the tug of war has come in, because the school administration wants to do the best for the child, but also needs to keep the budget in mind?
Well, certainly I think that sometimes there's this thought that, okay, more is better or more expensive is better, and that's not necessarily the case. No. And I think that that's where the potential of the tug of war is. It's really about always coming back to the student. What does the student need? How do we know? I always say that we're going to determine the what of special education before we determine the where or even the how. And sometimes we go ahead, we have these preconceived notions in our head that this is the only way that a child is going to make progress. And I think we have to kind of stop and pause, whether it be a special ed administrator, a building administrator, a teacher, a parent, to say, okay, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that students with disabilities are educated with their typical peers to the greatest extent possible.
So, I mean, in my own experience, my daughter was dyslexic, and she came from I think I've told this story before, she came from a school district where she had an incredible vocabulary, and they did not believe that she was in fact dyslexic. They thought I was looking for extra services, but they had a terrible program, and they stuck her in a desk and gave her a pile of things to do, and she could not possibly organize that stuff. And she came to Simsbury, and we chose Simsbury because it had a great reputation. And she came home the first day, and she was just overwhelmed. She said, "Mommy, they really want to help me here," and it was just amazing. And she was in special ed in the morning and the regular class in the afternoon. And by 6th grade, she said, "I don't want it anymore. I don't need it anymore." And she was very proud. She didn't want extra time on tests or anything, and she did fine. But those years, she desperately needed it.
It's really important. We always say that, well, at least I always say, my dream is to work myself out of a business, out of a job in this area of special education. But that's a phenomenal example that there is incredible remediation and skill building that we can do with specialized instruction. And your daughter is a great example of that. You bring up dyslexia. We're really focusing on 5 major areas in the department. And this is what I just presented to the Board of Ed last night. I said, I know I'm going to continue to bring up these topics because these are the topics that I really feel are going to give us the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to student success. One of those is achievement gap. Certainly when we look at our performance of students with disabilities as compared to like districts, we are doing very, very well. We have a lot of number one rankings based upon students with disabilities to students with disabilities. But when we look at the general population of Simsbury, we still have a gap. And that achievement gap might look different in Simsbury than it does in other communities, but we're making commitments to do things differently to close that gap. Certainly there's going to be some sort of an achievement gap. Otherwise, a student might not be identified as a student needing specialized instruction. Our second is dyslexia. As a big focus, there's certainly some legislative mandate to look at dyslexia, but we've formed a subcommittee of people who are committed to looking at what are the research-based practices and to stay on that cutting edge. We're also partnering with an expert in the field, Dr. Susan Lowell, who's going to be doing some PD, actually this month, professional development, sorry for the acronym, to be working with our department on really deepening our understanding, not only of dyslexia, but the specialized instruction that works, because we know that those things work. We're also focusing on our mental health. We know that there are a lot of stresses and strains that students come to the table with, specifically in Simsbury. And we're looking at how do we utilize our mental health faculty, whether that be school psychologists, guidance counselors, social workers, in the best way possible to support all students, not only identified students, but also general ed. Transition is another focus. Our job is to make sure that we prepare our students, specifically those with identified disabilities, for those next steps after public education. So whether that be work, whether that be college, we want to make sure that we are, again, at the front of those cutting edge practices, and we are implementing those in what we do. So, you certainly touched upon one of the major foci for us in the department, but we really do believe that putting our energies there is going to equate into results for our students.
So the difference between like an elementary school or a child who comes in middle school or junior high school or high school, is it a very different process does that happen here, or are kids?
Oh, sure. We have identification happen elementary, middle, high school. The process is similar to how Nancy explained it with our tiered system of intervention, going to evaluation if that's necessary and then making that identification. So it happens with students at all ages and certainly at grade levels. Mm-hmm. And different things happen for students. There may be some mental health concerns that arise as a student, ages through middle school and high school that may not have been present in elementary. And we want to make sure that we're paying attention to those needs as well.
So Nancy, are you both in the schools a lot, or are you in the office?
Oh, a little bit of both. I actually started the year dedicating there's 5 elementary schools, so my focus is elementary. 5 elementary schools, 5 days of the week seemed pretty perfect. So, because I really wanted to get a flavor of what was happening in the schools. So that's what I did. I was there. I've had to actually pull back a little bit. So there's this thing called paperwork that we need to get done. So, but that was really important for me to develop some relationships, to get to see kids, to see the teachers doing their great work. So I try to do a nice balance between being present in the schools, more than just being at IEP or PPT meetings, but being in the classrooms, being visible, and occasionally they actually let me interact with the students. So that's the real fun part.
Do you go to all the PPT meetings?
Great question. No, that would probably take 3 of me to be able to do that. I tend to go to meetings that one of the members of the team has asked me to be there. Sometimes a parent picks up the phone call and say, "Would you mind being there?" Sure. If there's a need or there's a potential issue that needs some clarification from administration, I'm happy to be there. Oftentimes it's the building principal that'll be the administrative representative if needed.
So how many kids are in the special ed program in Simsbury?
We have just over 500 that are identified. So we're at overall a percentage of about 13% in our district. We also look at special ed percentages within buildings to make sure nothing is seemingly out of whack there. But those are the the current
Is
figures.
13%, how does that compare to other school districts?
That's another great question. We're a little higher than the state average, but if you look within our DIRG, there's some interesting patterning regarding special ed percentages. It's something that we talk with our colleagues frequently about, kind of what's happening, what are we seeing, are we seeing some trends? And I think it comes back to what you had mentioned before. I think families come to Simsbury because they know that they'll receive a level of service that they believe their child needs. So I absolutely believe that impacts our incident rate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have 1 minute left. Each of you, 30 seconds. See, I told you it would go fast.
Yeah.
Something you want to add before we have to wrap up?
Just that it's a privilege working in Simsbury and continuing that collaboration and that partnership, not only with our families, our parents, our guardians, but our community members are really supportive of the work that we do, keeping the student at the center always in what we do.
Nancy?
I'm very excited looking forward to the future and working with the teams to create things, taking us to the next level. So that's really exciting.
Well, you've impressed me. I think you're a terrific hire.
Thank you.
I'm always so impressed by all the new people who come here. You're also very bright and well-spoken. We've actually run out of time. I'd like to thank everyone at SCTV behind the scenes, Jim Dempsey for his help on camera, and Karen for directing, and also Phyllis behind the scenes, and thanks to my guests, Sue Lemke and Nancy Forsberg.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. A reminder, thanks to SCTV volunteers, you can see all the Board of Education meetings on the second and the fourth Tuesday of the month. You could have seen Sue live last night. All those shows are live on Xfinity Channel 95 and Frontier 99. And they are online if you don't happen to live in Simsbury, or if you have a mother who lives in Massachusetts, for instance. If you missed any part of this show, you can find it anytime at simsburytv.org. I'm Dominique Avery. See you next time for Simsbury School News. Since 1984, SCTV has been the place to turn in Simsbury to watch local government in action. But we're more than local government and school meetings. SCTV is the only place where you can check out all the candidates in local elections. We have high school sports and exercise classes. Other shows keep you up on health, finance, poetry, music, and Simsbury hot topics. Now we need your help. Simsbury Community TV is embarking on a major capital fundraising campaign to bring SCTV into the 21st century. We've received a generous grant from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, but now we must match it. We want everyone to watch us on TV or on our website, but even if you never do, please help so that we can continue to keep your government open and you informed. Someday, when there's a crisis, you will want SCTV to be there.
Hi, my name is Greta Laurel, Vice President of Personal Insurance Sales with Summit First Insurance. I hope you'll join me in supporting SCTV. Since 1984, your connection to your town, your schools, and your government.